ladies and gentlemen, this month marks the centenary of the birth of John Terraine. Well, John, of course, was one of the most significant historians of the First World War and of the second half of the 20th century. He was also, of course, a very important figure in the history of the Western Front Association. He was the first honorary president of the WFA, and as his successor, but three in this role, I'm very pleased to be able to give this lecture to mark his anniversary. Actually, it's the first of two lectures on John Terraine that I will be giving this year, and thereby hangs a tale. I originally published an article back in 2004, shortly after John's death, which assessed his significance as a military historian, particularly of the Great War. Well, I later expanded that into a lecture, which I've given in various places, including a number of WFA branches. John's partner, Cathy Stevenson, who is well known to us, of course, as the chair of the London branch, then very kindly gave me access to John's papers. I've been working on these on and off to write a much more detailed document-based piece, which I hope will be published later this year. Well, I was intending to give you a taste of this material this evening, but last week when I was about to put it together, a horrible thought struck me. About 2 years ago, I discovered that knocking an entire cup of coffee over my laptop did not enhance the computer's performance. In fact, it completely destroyed it. As far as the data was concerned, I wasn't overly worried because it was all backed up. Except, as I realized last week, this particular piece of work was backed up on my memory stick, which I stupidly left in my work computer last time I was there. And of course, there's no way of getting access to it now because we're in lockdown. And yes, before anybody tells me about the cloud, I now know all about it and I've been using it for the last 2 years. So later in the year, when lockdown eases, I can get back into my office and recover my memory stick, I will be giving the lecture I intended to give today. But this evening, I'll be addressing a particular aspect of John's work, that is his work on high command. Of all the historical subjects for which John Terraine is best known, I suspect it's his rehabilitation of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Indeed, his critics regard him as an apologist for Haig that I think is the most important. John Terraine's boldest assertion was that Haig was a great captain, fit to stand alongside other great generals of the past. What I'm going to do today is to address this claim by examining Haig alongside one of Terraine's other great captains, the Duke of Wellington. I will be arguing, although at first sight it appears to be comparing apples with bananas, if not apples and umbrella stands, actually it makes a lot of sense to place the two men's careers in a common context, although we shouldn't push it too far. Well, John Terraine, of course, was above all else historian of 20th century warfare, but his interests went way beyond that, and so in fact did his publications. One of his distinctive contributions to the historiography was to assert the kinship between the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, the First World War of 1914 to 18, and the Second World War of 1939 to 45. He makes this case most clearly in his 1980 book, The Smoke and the Fire, which actually is probably my favorite book of John Terraine's. He argues there that these three wars were three wars linked by the fact they were all products of the Industrial Revolution. And in many ways, what happened in 20th century in the 20th century conflicts can be seen as developments of innovations in the 19th century, late 19th century in particular. He, for example, saw Ulysses S. Grant's attritional style of generalship in 1864 to 65 as very much of a piece with the generalship of Douglas Haig in the First World War, and even to some extent with that of Bernard Montgomery in the Second. Well, 40 years after he made this argument, I think scholarship on the American Civil War would modify Terraine's views, but I think he's hit upon the central truth. that is, there were indeed many continuities between the American Civil War and the First World War, and these continue to yield powerful insights. Well, John also engaged with the history of the Napoleonic Wars. In a 1950s article on Napoleon, reprinted in his book, The Western Front, which came out, I believe, in 1964, he showed that he was not one of the Corsican's biggest fans. Indeed, he saw Napoleon's use of brute force and big battalions in the latter stages of his career as a precursor of the First World War, and not in a good way. Terraine also wrote a book on the Battle of Trafalgar and contributed to a symposium and later a book on the generalship of the Duke of Wellington, edited by my former Sandhurst colleague, the late Paddy Griffin. Well, actually, I read, or rather reread John's book, chapter in Paddy's book, 5-6 years ago, I guess, when I was writing a very short biography of Wellington. And I was struck by John Terraine's common sense and also the way he did very effectively locate Wellington in the same tradition as Haig, in one very, very specific way, as a coalition commander. To quote from the beginning of John's chapter, he said, "Though I have been a great admirer of the Duke from boyhood, and this admiration has never faltered, I have never pretended to be any kind of expert in Wellingtonian studies." Having said that, he wrote, I thought, a very interesting and very insightful piece on Wellington, and it's using that and a few other bits and pieces that he wrote about Wellington that I am going to be judging his views and his ideas about placing Haig in the same category. Well, in a 1981 article on British Generals, Terraine wrote that it was Field Marshal Lord Slim who pointed out that the general has no other duty compared to that of obtaining victory. Looking back from 1989, the article I've taken this from is on the WFA website, by the way, and it first appeared in Stand 2 in 1989. Terraine wrote, "I remarked that the next question is evidently what kind of victory, and I went on, the toughest assignment in modern British military history has been high command in war against the main body of a main continental enemy. 3 British officers have undertaken such a task and brought it to a successful conclusion: the Duke of Marlborough, the Duke of Wellington, and Field Marshal Lord Haig. So that is our category. That is where Haig belongs." This is a very big claim, and I'll be examining it by briefly comparing Wellington's and Haig's lives, pointing out the differences, then pointing out some important features that they indeed have in common in their career. And I'll then conclude by asking how well John Terraine's argument that Haig was a great captain in the League of Wellington and deserves to be in the same company as him stands up to modern scholarship and scrutiny. Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, is clearly one of the big beasts of British history, and not just British military history, although I'll leave his political role largely to one side. I'm happy to deal with that in the questions. In military terms, his fame rests as the victor of the Peninsular War fought in Portugal and Spain between 1808 and 1814. More particularly, he had a sort of false start there, but came back to command an unbroken period from 1809 onwards. And then, in a very different situation with a very different army, as the leader of the Anglo-Dutch German coalition army, which defeated Napoleon in combination with the Prussians under Blucher at Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815. Now, interestingly, by John Terraine's own definition, Wellington only played in the big league once. That is during what we might now call the first 100 days. That is the Waterloo campaign, which effectively took place over a matter of several weeks in June and early July 1815. The Peninsular War was a very significant victory. There's no two ways about it. But what I think is important to take on board is that he was not up against Napoleon. Indeed, one of the things which greatly aided Wellington in his victory in the Peninsula is that he was always fighting individual French armies commanded by individual French generals, or more usually marshals, and there was no overall commander, or at least no effective overall commander in Spain, and the different French marshals were fiercely jealous of each other and frequently went out of their way not to aid their fellow marshals. All of this greatly aided Wellington, and his command arrangements, which I'll speak about in a little while, were very different and much more beneficial. He was also greatly aided by the fact that the bulk of French troops in the Iberian Peninsula were pinned down or dealing with Spanish forces of various sorts, regular forces which got beaten with monotonous regularity but then reformed just as quickly, and guerrillas, all of which made this, again, a fairly advantageous strategic situation in which Wellington could operate. For all that, he had his fair share of setbacks, numerous retreats. He never actually lost a battle, but in strategic terms, he really was unable to achieve a major success, I would argue, until 1812. And Wellington's resilience as a commander, I think, is something which comes out big time in this period. Looking at Wellington under the headings of the three levels of warfare, that is the strategic level, the operational level, and tactical level, he was excellent at both. He had wide strategic vision. So even in 1812, after winning one of his greatest victories, Salamanca, in July 1812, he then in many ways overextended himself and was forced into on the surface, humiliating retreat from Burgos back to Portugal. But he realized that his actions in 1812, by forcing the French to concentrate against him, thus abandoning big chunks of the countryside to the guerrillas, meant that he was going to start the 1813 campaign very much on the front foot strategically, which proved to be the case. At the operational, that is campaign level, he had a rare talent for fitting all of these individual tactical battles together and seeing the big picture. And both on the offensive, because in spite of his popular reputation, Wellington was just as effective as an aggressive general as he was a defensive one. He really has no peers in British military history, at least in my view. 2 points about Wellington's command style. He was a centralizer. He was not a believer in what today we would call mission command, that is, devolving command authority to lower levels. If any, he was a centralizer. He could be very secretive, and of course, he did not have anything like a staff in the modern sense. He was very much a one-man band. All of this led me to argue in my little book that, in spite of my admiration for Wellington, which is genuine, I wonder whether he was a great general for his time. In other words, if he was put into a 20th century context, if he actually fought in the First or Second World War, I very much doubt whether his command style would actually have worn well. Of course, whether he would have adapted his command style to adjust to the new circumstances of 1418, we can never know. I suspect he probably would have done. The big difference, of course, between Wellington's tenure of command as a general and Haig's is that warfare had undergone truly profound changes in the 100-odd years, in fact, the 99 years, between Wellington's last military operation, Waterloo in 1815, and when Haig took First Corps to France in 1914. And I think we can sum up these changes of warfare under two broad headings: the impact of the French Revolution and the impact of the Industrial Revolution. The French Revolution did not bring about any changes in terms of technology, or at least not ones that really mattered in the terms we're talking about. What it did, however, was unleash nationalism and allow nationalism to be linked to statehood and political objectives. In practical terms, this meant that armies got bigger and bigger, wars got bigger and bigger, and so whereas Wellington, sorry, wrong guy, Napoleon had about 600,000 troops poised for the invasion of Russia in 1812, which was an enormous army. I mean, the largest army really known up to that point. By the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, we're talking about armies that were over 1 million strong. And by the time of the First World War, 50 years after that, we're talking about armies which are millions, plural, strong. The second change is that brought about by the Industrial Revolution, which brought a whole series of technological developments, whether it be the development of smokeless gunpowder, the development of breech-loading rifles, of quick-firing modern artillery, railways, which enabled troops to be moved around countries, continents, far more quickly than would be possible under Napoleon's days, or the telegraph, which enabled armies, or at least headquarters, to be kept in touch with governments at home. All of this meant that warfare by 1900, let alone by 1914 or 1918, looked radically different from that Wellington had known. So therefore, it's always a bit of a stretch to compare generals from such radically different periods of history. Wellington and Haig were actually not very far apart in time. Wellington died in 1852, Haig was born in 1861, but their military careers were from different epochs. So I'm a bit dubious about whether we can really make too many meaningful, straightforward comparisons between Wellington and Haig. Well, Haig, I will say relatively little about, because I suspect, or at least I hope, most of this audience will know a fair bit about him. His fame, his infamy, if you like, depends on how his record in the First World War is judged, and primarily by his tenure in command of the British Expeditionary Force from late 1915 through to the end of the fighting on the Western Front, in fact, until April 1919. He was the man who presided over what can be seen as one of the greatest disasters in British military history, the Battle of the Somme, or at least the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. He also presided over what I think John Terraine was right in arguing was the greatest British military victory in history, that is the victory in the 100 Days of 1918. And of course, opinions on Haig's blame for the disasters or responsibility for the successes are extremely polarized. I'm generally positive about Haig's contribution. Have a look at my biography if you want more details. Other historians, including in recent years Paul Harris, are much more negative. I'm actually going to sort of argue from my point of view that Haig on the whole was, in broad terms, a good thing, an effective commander, but I will recognise there is certainly a different argument that can be made. So to what extent can we compare Haig with Wellington? Well, both proved to be winners, both commanded British armies in major operations. And I've already pointed out, it's actually quite difficult then to make direct comparisons. But what I'm going to do now is to suggest that rather than comparing on a like-for-like basis, we place Haig and Wellington in the context of the experience of British generalship really over the last 300 years. And I'll be mainly talking about our two heroes this evening, but I'm going to be mentioning some other British generals en route and suggesting really all of them to a greater or lesser degree were shaped by some common experiences. Well, the first one is really the fact that when Britain goes to war, major war that is, against major enemies, the British state is normally unready to engage in protracted warfare. So in 1793, when Britain went to war against revolutionary France, the war which eventually turned into the war against Napoleonic France, really all that Britain had to send to Flanders in terms of troops was a weak brigade of the Guards. 10, 15 years before, the British Army, and for that matter, the Royal Navy, had been extremely large and a peak of effectiveness. But then at the end of the American War of Independence, that army had been greatly cut in size. And the Brits were playing catch up from 1793 onwards. The young Lieutenant Colonel Wellesley of the 33rd Foot, later of course the Duke of Wellington's regiment, fought in Flanders in 1794-95, and late in life, as the famous Duke of Wellington, he was asked what he learned from his first campaign, and his answer was, "I learned what not to do, and that is always something." In fact, Wellesley in this campaign suffered many of the privations and problems that other British commanders were to suffer at the beginning of major wars in the future. Under-equipped army, poorly organized up against a more powerful enemy, forced into a demoralizing defeat and then retreat, albeit one in which the army did succeed eventually in being evacuated by the Royal Navy. In the same way, Douglas Haig faced a similar situation of lacking resources and having to carry out mass improvisation, both when he went to war as a junior staff officer against the Boers in 1899, and then of course as commander of First Corps in 1914 and 1915. This generalship of famine has meant that historically British generals have normally had to carry out a great deal of improvisation and making use of scant resources. Wars tend to start with the generalship of famine. Anthony Eden, who was a senior politician in the Second World War and of course a junior officer and then a junior staff officer in the First World War, late in life said that British officers should never be in overall command at the beginning of a long war. He said you need to wait until 2 or 3 years down the track when all the stuff starts to come along. And of course, he's absolutely right about that. Both Wellington and Haig benefited that in both cases, they were not in positions of overall command at the beginning of the war. Neither, of course, was Bernard Montgomery. And so just as Wellington from 1809 onwards, Haig from 1916 onwards, and Montgomery from 1942 onwards were able to reap the benefit of resources arriving in theatre, of larger armies, of better organisation and all the rest of it, but spare a thought for their predecessors, the likes of the Duke of York, Sir John French, and Sir Archibald Wavell. As high commanders, Wellington in 1813-14 and Haig in 1918 were able to fight to adapt John Bourne's phrase, a rich man's war, having sizable armies, plentiful resources. Though interestingly, of course, Wellington in 1815 was thrown back to an earlier stage because his great peninsular army was dispersed. Chunks of it were actually in North America, or at least returning from North America. They'd been sent there to fight against the United States in the War of 1812. And so Wellington's army at Waterloo the British bits tended to be sort of understrength second battalions, and a not terribly well experienced, and his Brits were in a minority among Germans from various states, Dutch and Belgians, an infamous army, as Wellington famously called it. One final point under this heading, it's worth pointing out that colonial troops were extremely important to both Wellington and Haig. I'll say more about Wellington in India at the moment, but the bulk of his troops were actually Indians rather than British. And again, in the peninsula, about a third of his army actually was composed of Portuguese. And Haig, in 1915, certainly relied heavily on the Indian Corps, and later as Commander-in-Chief, Dominion forces, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and some South Africans, proved to be extremely important. Actually, they had an importance in excess of their sheer numbers. The second point I want to make is that British generals, and Haig and Wellington were no exception, have a small wars heritage, or to use the phrase that Napoleon used scathingly about Wellington, they were Sepoy generals, Sepoy being the term, of course, for an Indian soldier fighting under British or French command. It's worth pointing out that Wellington bucked the trend of the development of warfare brought about by the French Revolution, that I explained a few minutes ago. Wellington's army was very much an 18th century army, an ancien regime army, which he basically turned into a highly effective force because he'd already had that latent ability to be highly effective, and Wellington's greatness as a general. And at least part of this, I think, goes back to his apprenticeship as a commander, which was in India, from the late 18th century through to his return to Europe in 1805. Wellington, or Wellesley as he still was at the time, had a huge asset in the form of his brother, Richard, Lord Mornington, who was Governor General in the British part of India at that period. And between them, the Wellesley brothers pursued a very aggressive strategy of adding large chunks of the Indian subcontinent to the British Empire. And this was by no means a pushover. Scholarship in recent years have actually sort of done away with the idea that the British under Arthur Wellesley were fighting sort of, poorly equipped Indian forces. They were up against some really excellent troops trained by Europeans, often French mercenaries, who could give as good as they got. The Battle of Assaye in 1805, Wellington's first major victory, and in percentage terms perhaps his bloodiest, was actually a really steep baptism of fire because of the sheer quality of the forces that Wellington found himself up against. And it was in India that Wellington found himself having to conduct serious coalition warfare, more about that in a minute, but also it's where he learned the importance of logistics, or rather probably relearned them, because he certainly could not have failed to have logistics impressed upon him in the 1794-95 Flanders campaign. So what we saw in Wellesley's time in India was him mastering small wars, but fought over a large area, gripping the whole question of logistics to a very, very strong degree. If you go back and look through Wellesley's dispatches and his letters, which of course have been published, he concentrates extremely heavily on the importance of logistics and the humble bullock cart, which is the basic way of getting supplies from A to B, looms very large in his life. The Indian period, I think, taught Wellington self-reliance, initiative, and enabled him to come up with a style of warfare which he nicknamed light and quick, which enabled him to take advantage of the maneuverability of his troops. So Wellington was very much a sepoy general and was proud to be as such. That was his apprenticeship. Without India, I don't think that you get the Peninsular War being fought in the way that it was. Haig too, here pictured on campaign in South Africa, was also a sepoy general in that sense. He learnt, first of all, as a staff officer, as the chief staff officer to John French, Major General John French's cavalry division, later as a column commander, in effect a brigade commander. He learnt a degree of ruthlessness in war, which chimes in with another recent theme in historiography, that is, the roots of total war can be traced back to colonial war. Haig was a fairly ruthless counterinsurgent, for example, in the way he dealt with Boer insurgents. And he too, I think, learned a number of extremely important lessons from South Africa. Again, not least the importance of logistics, which he applied with great effect on the Western Front. And of course, Wellington and Haig were just two of the generals, British generals of this period, who were affected by, or shaped, I should say, by colonial warfare, small wars in some shape or form. I can't stress enough that the Western Front, which ran for the British from August 1914, of course, to November 1918, was very much an aberration. You didn't have anything like that in the Second World War, at least not for the British. The British fought the main enemy in the main theatre of operations only once, for 6 weeks, in May, June 1940. Thereafter, their campaigns, although important and sizable, were not the main front. That, of course, was the Eastern Front, the Russian front from 1941 onwards. And in fact, in both world wars, we saw what we might describe as big, small wars in a World War context. So, for example, if you think about the First World War, the Mesopotamian campaign, Palestine and East Africa, probably has more in common with the Eritrean, Syrian, Iraq, perhaps even the Burma campaign of the Second World War than they did with the Western Front in France and Belgium. So Haig, I think, is out on his own in conducting that sort of major front for that long period of time. No other British commander, with the possible exception of Marlborough, but even then the parallels aren't exact, had quite the same experience as Haig, which slightly puts a question mark against John Terraine's comparison of Haig and Wellington. Coalition warfare. Well, this is the thing which actually John Terraine was writing about in the collection of essays on Wellington. And I think that Terraine showed himself a master at understanding the importance of coalition warfare and actually bringing it to the forefront of certainly popular history of the First World War. No one was really writing very much about coalition warfare when John Terraine started. He was a really, I think, major figure in bringing out the importance of this facet. And of course, it's absolutely critical. As we've already seen, Wellington in India was a coalition commander. He had to deal with a whole series of Indian princes, And all of these people needed to make sure that they were flattered, they were cajoled, they felt they had a stake in the campaign, that they were treated seriously. The Duke of Marlborough, back in the early 18th century, had a similar keen understanding of the importance of allies. So did Douglas Haig in the First World War. Having said that, neither Haig nor Wellington were completely squeaky clean when it came to dealing with their allies. Wellington in particular had a very fractious relationship with the Spanish government. He was appointed a sort of fit of enthusiasm as commander-in-chief of the Spanish armies, and then the Spaniards found to their horror that he intended actually to take this seriously. This led him down some extremely murky byways of Spanish politics. But Wellington was essentially a man who understood the importance of coalition warfare, and although not perfect at it, he did well enough. The same, I think, is true with Haig. Now, if you read Haig's diaries, which I edited with John Bourne some 15 years ago now, you can see him making a lot of quite rude, even inflammatory comments in his diaries about his coalition allies, about the French, about Joffre and Foch, for example, about Pershing, the American commander, who he described as remarkably stupid, about the Italians, and so on and so forth. Now, I think the point about this is that these were his private diaries in which he used them to sound off, to let off steam, if you like, because on the whole, Haig was a coalition good citizen, someone who recognized the absolute vital importance of keeping his coalition allies on side and devoted a great deal of his time and effort to making sure that this actually worked. The relationship between Haig and Foch in 1918, I think, is particularly important. Haig, I think, rather reluctantly acceded to the appointment of Foch as Supreme Allied Commander, but he recognized the importance of it. Indeed, I think Haig's unwillingness to allow an overall coalition commander before that time was founded in his bad experience with Nivelle in 1917, and it did indeed lead to problems in early 1918. But he, I think, overcame that, and I think was a coalition good citizen after that. In particular, I think that Foch and Haig trusted each other. They'd worked with each other as far back as the First Battle of Ypres, the end of 1914, and effectively, Haig was Foch's senior lieutenant during the 100 days. Certainly, Foch thought that he could rely on Haig and the British Army to a greater degree than the other Allied armies for different reasons. And Haig had a very important impact in shaping overall Allied strategy. So Haig was certainly a coalition general. Man liked it very much, but actually he was quite decent at it. And so, for that matter, was Wellington. Wellington, of course, had a difficult relationship with Blucher and the Prussians, not as much Blucher himself, but with the Prussian armies, partly, in fact, founded on the fact that Britain and Prussia had been, the relations between them had not been good in the months following the first defeat of Napoleon and the return of Napoleon to France. But nonetheless, they cooperated effectively enough in the Waterloo campaign. And this is in part down to both the British and the Prussians giving way and meeting somewhere in the middle. By no means was it a perfect relationship, but again, it worked well enough. It's also worth bearing in mind that both Wellington and Haig, as I've already alluded to, their own armies were coalition forces. Wellington was in some ways more fortunate than Haig, in that he was effectively given the Portuguese army to do with whatever he liked. There was a British general, William Carr Beresford, who was appointed as Marshal of Portugal, and he trained and organised the Portuguese army under using British methods and to British standards, to the extent that by the end of the Peninsular War, really Portuguese troops were pretty well as good as the British. Wellington described them as the fighting cocks of the army. Sad contrast to Portuguese performance of Portuguese troops in 1918, but I think that's as much to do with the poor training of the Portuguese army in 1918 as anything else. I think under decent officers, they would have made good troops. Haig wasn't quite so fortunate in that, as I've already mentioned, some of his most effective troops were in effect, to use the phrase of a Canadian historian, junior but sovereign allies, that is the Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders. They could not be treated just as Brits with sort of strange accents. They actually had to be treated as sovereign troops to some extent. So Haig couldn't give them orders in quite the same way as Wellington could give orders to the Portuguese. So Haig had to learn and come to terms with a good deal of independence of the Dominion forces, and he had to learn tact. But on the whole, I think he was pretty good at doing that. Attritional warfare. Well, Haig, of course, his name is synonymous with attrition. In his final dispatch, written after the 100 Days, he argued that the victories of the advance to victory in 1918 were the payoff for the grueling battles of attrition from 1915 onwards, that by grinding down German strength and morale on the battlefield of the Somme and Arras and Ypres and so on and so forth, he set the German army up for the coup de grace in 1918. And this, of course, was the foundation of what has become known as the Terraine thesis, or at least one part of the Terraine thesis, that John Terraine took Haig's insight and basically ran with it in numerous books. If I could just quote here from the review by Shelford Bidwell of John Terraine's book from 1978, To Win a War, which is about 1918. Bidwell wrote, "Mr. Terraine's war is also concluded. He has made a long, dogged advance under a hot, critical fire, directed too often at his theme and himself rather than the text. But following the best principles of war, he has resolutely maintained his aim and now stands triumphantly on his objective." Well, whether actually John Terraine did convince everybody is a moot point. My view is that you can't accept either Haig's final dispatch or Terraine's version of it at face value, but nonetheless, it is very, very difficult to completely debunk it. I would certainly modify it, but I would say that Haig and Terraine really, I think Bidwell is right, do occupy that ground which successive attacks by pundits and historians of various sorts have failed to remove them. Again, just as I was saying about the American Civil War earlier, any historian today looking at those claims in the light of more recent research would modify them, but I don't think they would completely displace them, let alone utterly debunk them. But Haig has gone down as an attritional general, and to be honest, he had no option but to fight his battles in an attritional way. We can argue about whether he did it in the most economical way, whether in fact he made the best use of the material, but the essential idea behind it of attrition, I think, was inevitable given the circumstances in which he and the British, and indeed the entire Allied armies, found themselves in the years 1916, 17 and 18. But was Wellington an attritional general as well? Well, yes, he was. Perhaps he's not often thought of as such, but Wellington could be highly attritional on occasions. Whether he was engaging in counterinsurgency against Indian bandits in the early years of the 18th century, carrying out very modern, as in, I suppose, 20th century counterinsurgency concepts such as food denial, fighting grimly attritional battles like I say, or indeed his conduct, certainly the beginning part of the Peninsular War. Wellington was deeply attritional, or at least was prepared to use attrition in his favour. The best example of this came in the years 1810 to 1811, when first of all he constructed a series of fortifications, the so-called lines of Torres Vedras, near Lisbon, which covered an area which he could withdraw his Anglo-Portuguese army into, with the possibility of evacuation by sea if everything went horribly wrong. But he really didn't need to do that, because after defeating the French tactically at the Battle of Busaco in 1810, he then withdrew all the way back to the lines of Torres Vedras, conducting a ruthless scorched earth policy in the process, which denied the French armies, reliant very largely on living off the land, of having any food or material to gather by foraging, by basically which we mean going around and mugging local peasants. It also meant that the local Portuguese civilians also had a very tough time. This was attrition with a vengeance. And Massena's French army encamped impotently outside the lines of Torres Vedras, withered on the vine, as much through failures of logistics as fighting. And Wellington, on numerous occasions, resisted the temptation to take the offensive, because he could see that starvation was going to do to the French army what a bloody and potentially risky battle would do. He referred to this as my cautious system, to operate on the flanks and rear of the enemy with my small and light detachments and force them out of Portugal by the distresses they will suffer, and do them all the mischief I can upon their retreat, in combination with Portuguese guerrillas and light troops, and then of course much the same in Spain. That is exactly what Wellington did, to huge effect. I would argue the comparison of attrition with Wellington is not so much with Haig, which was suggested really had no option but to fight in a traditional way given the tactical circumstances, but with Montgomery, who ground down the enemy in North Africa and Normandy before he was able to conduct battles of manoeuvre. Those battles of manoeuvre, which were then available to Wellington, were never really available to Haig because of the tactical circumstances of 1918, despite the fact he desperately wished they were, and at times believed that conditions had arrived. Well, to conclude, let me draw together some threads of Wellington, Haig, and the British tradition of generalship. My argument is that all British high commanders in the last 300 years, at least those ones who have been engaged in major operations against a major enemy, were shaped by common factors to a greater or lesser degree. They were shaped by the unreadiness of the British state to engage in protracted warfare, hence having to improvise, having to make do, to carry out warfare which, to use terms applied of Wavell in the Middle East in 1940-41, was a thing of shreds and patches. They drew upon the small wars heritage, or Sepoy Generalship, that the British Army has routinely been engaged in small wars, counterinsurgency, frontier fighting. Really only very rarely has it had to engage in the sort of major warfare that Haig fought between 1914 and 1918, or for that matter, Wellington between 1808 and 1815. So every commander, with I suspect you can make a bit of an exception for Second World War commanders who were not junior officers in the First World War. There were a few. Everybody has been largely shaped. Sorry, I've got the wrong way around. British commanders of the Second World War who were shaped by the experience of the First World War. Everybody else, their major experiences have been, formative experiences have been of small wars. Coalition warfare also, certainly in major war, has been a defining factor. And I think that Terraine hit the nail on the head when he linked together Marlborough up there in the tricorn hat on the slide, Wellington and Haig. And I would also add to that Bill Slim in 14th Army, which I realised to my horror, actually that image has been reproduced back to front. Apologies for that. Or has it? No, sorry, that's complete nonsense. It's actually the right way around. Slim, because of his complex relations with the Americans, with Stilwell, and also with the Chinese, he, and along with many other commanders, deserve to be put into the coalition bracket when it comes to formative influences. And finally, attrition. Small wars, counterinsurgency tends to be attritional by their very nature. And certainly all the high commanders of the First World War who had experience as junior officers in the First, and that was most of them, would have had a lot of experience of attrition, whether it be on the Western Front or indeed on some of the other so-called sideshow theatres. Well, clearly, the parallels between Wellington and Haig are not exact, and some of them seem a bit forced. If you're going to compare Wellington with anybody, I suspect that the most obvious comparison is with John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, 100 or so years before. But even then, the parallels are not exact. Churchill had a long spell as the British commander of a multinational army in the main theatre, which Wellington didn't. Marlborough's grip on the government and monarch was mostly greater than Wellington's. And of course, Wellington really only faced the main army and the main enemy in the main theatre of operations only once, in the Waterloo campaign. So if a sensible comparison with Haig is difficult because of the very different circumstances and types of warfare, I think we can at least agree that Haig and Wellington do actually rest squarely within the tradition of British generalship. So where does this leave this idea of Wellington and Haig being fellow great captains as put forward by John Terraine? I must say, actually, I don't really buy it. As I've just made clear, I think there are some comparisons to be made between Haig and Wellington. And in his article in Paddy Griffith's book, John Terraine made, I thought, a very cogent case for comparing Wellington and Haig as coalition generals. But the situations of 1418 and the Peninsula Waterloo were simply too different. I think what we need to look at here is the way that warfare had actually changed between Wellington's day and Haig's day. Whatever you might say about Douglas Haig as a commander, I don't think you can actually come up with a fair comparison with him as a battlefield general in the same way, in the same breath, that is, as Wellington, because simply his job was different. Wellington was a military manager. His job was to sit behind a desk, marshalling resources, giving out orders to subordinates who would execute them in a way that was alien to Wellington. Haig's desire certainly was to command from the front, as Wellington did. We can see that with his ride to the front at the crisis of the First Battle of Ypres on Halloween 1914. But things were radically different by 1914. Wellington's style of command at Waterloo, sitting on a horse and either physically riding to give orders himself or sending off an aide-de-camp on a horse to gallop 2 or 3 miles to another part of the army, simply was not possible for Douglas Haig. The military developments of the previous 100 years meant that armies were now much too big and much too dispersed for that sort of personal command. Also add to the fact that communications had lagged behind other military developments. I've made this point, in fact, John Terraine had long before me, that the First World War is a unique war, one fought without voice communications. Wellington could personally give orders to his troops. Haig had to send his orders out remotely and had to wait for information to come in, there being a big time gap. That basically meant that Haig did not have a battlefield role in the same way as Wellington did. So to conclude, I would say that John Terraine, historian for whom I have a huge amount of admiration, actually was wrong to lump together Haig and Wellington as great commanders. I think for once he was asking the wrong questions, that Wellington's style of command and the sort of war that he was waging was so different from that of 100 years later, the sort in which Haig was engaged, that it renders direct comparisons between the two generals largely meaningless. Yes, they did have some things in common. Yes, I think we can see them as coming from the same tradition of British command, but Wellington and Haig were not great captains, at least not in the sense that Terraine would have you believe. I think that Haig should be judged on his own merits. He should not be put artificially into a commander who is really an 18th century commander located into an early 19th century context. Things are too different. Haig and Wellington both had their merits, but they should be judged on those merits by the standards of their own eras. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Sorry, the with a great commander slide should have come up on my last spiel. Apologies for that.
No problem. Gary, thanks very much indeed. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And if everybody would like to do the usual virtual round of applause by method of pressing the raise hand button, that would be splendid. And Gary, I can confirm that there's hundreds of hands going up as a round of applause for that. Gary, do you want to say anything about that slide there? It's obviously a reference to something that you want to talk about.
It's a shameless bit of self-promotion for the master's course, which I run along with Spencer Jones at Wolverhampton. We're recruiting for next year, and by any luck, we'll be able to have it face-to-face by this time next year. At the moment, we're having a mixture of face-to-face and online teaching, but yeah, we'll all be up and running by October by then.
Super, thanks very much. So Q&As, right. So we've got a few questions. One that came in via email, actually. So I wouldn't normally read Q&As out off emails, but on this occasion I'll break the rule. Partially thanks to advances in speed of communications, Haig had to contend with direct political influence over his command, whereas Wellington enjoyed more autonomy. Wellington then became a politician and Prime Minister, whereas Haig concentrated on ex-servicemen after their military careers ended. How do you think their differing experiences with politics served their reputations as against their military records? And that question's from Rob Thrush. So, Gary.
Thank you. Well, the first thing to say is that Wellington was a politician before he was a general. He was a member of the Irish Parliament. He, for big chunks of his time, was even as a serving officer. He was as much a politician as a general, and Haig never was. Haig was actually very political with a big and a small p, but he never really fancied himself as a politician in the way that Wellington did. And I think you can actually interpret Wellington's early career is that he only started to take his military career seriously when he failed to get preferment as a politician in Dublin. Now, Wellington's reputation went into a bit of a trough in the 1820s and 1830s because, of course, he was an active politician. He was, of course, prime minister on two occasions. One interpretation of his nickname, the Iron Duke, is because he actually had to have iron railings erected around the Sorry, I've done something to Zoom. I'm back again now. He actually had to have iron railings erected around Apsley House, his townhouse in London, because he was so unpopular. But after he retired from frontline politics, that sort of started to disappear. And by the time of his death, he had become on the way to becoming anyway the sort of national hero that we sort of think of him today, largely because people started sort of differentiating Wellington the hero from Wellington the politician. So Wellington's reputation did actually sort of depend to some degree on what odor he was in with the rest of the population. Now Haig, it's wrong to say, as some people do, that he did not go into politics after the First World War. He did. What he did not do was go into electoral politics. He concentrated, as our questioner suggested, on the welfare of ex-servicemen, but he did so in an extremely political way. He actually became, in effect, the unofficial leader of ex-servicemen, and he lambasted politicians in giving evidence to select committees and so on and so forth, and was by no means backwards in coming forward when it came to standing up for ex-servicemen against politicians. Now, what he was keen not to do was to overstep the mark. So when it was pointed out to him that actually he was embarrassing the broadly conservative government of the time, he somewhat dialed back on his criticisms of the government. And he also was fairly outspoken in views in other ways. So during the general strike of 1926, actually, he took a very, very hard line against the strikers, in spite of the fact that at the time he was president of the British Legion, with very sizable numbers of working class men in it, many of whom actually would have been on strike. So Haig, to return directly to the question, Haig's reputation benefited in the short term from his engagement with the ex-servicemen's question, because it made him very popular. He was more popular in the 20s, I would suggest, than he was during the war itself. And part of this is down to the fact he was very visibly the champion of the ex-servicemen. Wellington had a rather different trajectory, but ultimately Wellington was both a politician and a general. Haig was primarily a soldier who did politics sometimes, but I think there is actually a difference between the two men.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's take the next question. So Mo, do you want to start your video there, Mo?
Camera doesn't work. You'll just have to have me on audio only. Is that
no worries, we can hear you there. Please do carry on.
Okay, you've got the question. I haven't. I've forgotten it.
Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, go on. Thanks.
Okay, most question is this: Wellington stymied the development of the British Army until the Crimea in 1854. Did Haig have any similar effect post-World War II? Post-World War One?
Well, first of all, I'd say I actually think that's rather unfair on Wellington. I mean, he was a conservative. Recent scholarship has suggested that you can overdo the extent to which he retarded the development of the British Army by the time of the Crimea. There's certainly some truth in it. Haig actually had remarkably little influence on the British Army after he retired. In part, that was because I think he deliberately took a backward step. He was dealing with the ex-servicemen. Occasionally he was brought back. So, for example, he wrote a paper on the future of cavalry, in which his predictions about future warfare were almost entirely wrong, but almost everybody else's were at that time as well, because at the time he was writing, it seemed extremely likely that the horse would continue to have a major role in the battlefield. He was not alone in believing that. And he also believed that Britain would not be involved in a war which had something like the Western Front again, which of course he was wrong about that, but he just could not see Britain getting into that sort of war. So the short answer is no. He spent most of his time actually not engaging with modern debates, although his successors did actually consult with him to a certain degree. If I could actually say, one of the things which he was has been bashed for over the years is his infamous statement, I think it was in 1926, that the horse, there will always be a place for the well-bred horse on the battlefield. And Little Hart in particular made great play of this. Well, actually, in the course of my research, I went back and looked at his original speech. The reference to horse breeding is because he was talking to the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. Horse breeding was a science. And the well-bred horse meant just that. Horses were better for military use than horses had been 50 or 100 years before that. And he basically expressing the idea that horse breeding as a science would continue. And as for this idea that horses could have a place on the battlefield, actually they did. Certainly into the 1930s, and very few people in the mid-1920s would have predicted the removal of the horse from the British Army by 1939. Lots of other armies had them. Germans, for example, and indeed the Russians had large numbers of horse cavalry on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. So I think Haig has been unfairly bashed for the fact that he wasn't very good at crystal ball reading.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for your question there, Mo. That was great. Richard Owen, do you want to? You should be live there. Do you want to ask Gary Sheffield your question?
Gary, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Gary, good evening, and nice to see you looking so well.
Thank you.
My question is a follow-up, really, to your initial statement that Haig took an important view towards his relationship towards his allies. Mm-hmm. So my question is, did the French generals regard their allies with the same degree of courtesy?
Some did, some didn't. It's fair to say. Foch was pretty good at it, and that's one of the reasons why he was really good as a generalissimo in 1918. Nivelle, on the other hand, conspired, not with British generals, to be fair, but with British politicians, namely Lloyd George, actually to have Haig placed under French generalship. Joffre had his moments, but broadly speaking, he was respectful of Haig's role. Pétain, I think, was pretty good. So on the whole, yes. Gosh, who am I thinking of? Complete brain freeze. The French commander of French Fifth Army in 1914, who had a dust up with Sir John French. I can't remember his name. Longrezac. Clearly, he didn't really get the memo about being nice to your allies. On the whole, I think that senior French commanders did, because it is basic stuff. If you're in a coalition, you need to make sure that you sort of don't alienate your coalition partners too much. it's a cliche which I've trotted out to generations of students, that whenever in a coalition war, you'll think your coalition partners are the most unreasonable bunch of so-and-sos you ever come across. The odd thing is, they think the same about you, and even odder thing is, you're both right. Because coalitions are not married, they are marriages of convenience rather than love matches. Coalitions come about because states come together to pool their resources to defeat a major threat. States have different objectives. They have different ideas. They have different military cultures. Question is, you've got to learn to rub along together. And in many ways, one of the deciding factors in the First World War is that the Allied coalition, France, Britain, Russia, United States, so on and so forth, actually held together better than the Central Powers coalition, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire, because the Germans came to dominate their coalition partners in a way that, for example, the French never did on the Allied side.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your question there, Richard. Linda, you just want to unmute yourself there?
Hello, thank you for a really interesting talk, but
thanks, Linda.
I got a bit confused at the end, in the sense that if the comparisons don't really hold up, so what is the point? And is it to show what's unique about each situation? When you're comparing something, the different time, different technology, different war, does the comparison then serve to show what's unique and different about each situation?
Okay, well, thank you. That's a very, very, very interesting question. I can't remember who said it, but there was a historian who said that you can split historians into two groups, lumpers and splitters. People like to lump individuals and themes together, those who like to split them up. Actually, I'm probably more of a lumper than I am a splitter, to be honest. And of course, the excuse for this lecture was to look at John Terraine's views, because of what I said earlier, throwing a cup of coffee over my laptop and leaving my PowerPoint, my memory stick plugged into my computer at work. Because I think, as I said, I think John Terraine is a genuinely great historian, but I really think that he stretched that comparison too far. So I thought, so the first purpose of my lecture actually was to say that I really don't think you can compare Haig and Wellington in that way. But more broadly, you certainly can put them in the same context. Whether you call that comparing or something else, I don't know. Because there is, this strikes me, this tradition of British generalship, which shapes both Haig and Wellington. And I tend to think that you get more about understanding the continuities of warfare than you do of the differences. So I would sort of defend my comparing these two generals and say, yeah, actually, on a direct comparison, it doesn't work so well. But, you know, in a broader context, actually, it does. And I think comparing, I mean, two sort of, in many ways, fairly dissimilar commanders from dissimilar periods, Wellington and Haig, I hope, as I showed this evening, actually showed they really had more in common in terms of their formative influences and everything else than you might expect. I should actually say that I have done, well, I've done a lot of research on Haig. I've written actually now 3 books on him. I have done a lot less original research on Wellington, though like John Terraine, I've read about Wellington for many years. One of the first grown-up military history books I can remember reading was Elizabeth Longford's Wellington's The Years of the Sword. I have written a very short biography of Wellington. For me, it was one of the most difficult books I've ever had to write. You know, when my first draft was 40,000 words, I had to cut it in half. But it did make me think. It did make me bring in comparisons. It tried to make me think about how can I make this different from every other biography of Wellington. And it struck me that there were some real comparison to be drawn, not directly, but rather in terms of context.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you for that. Gordon Holmes.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, Gordon.
Hello, Gary. Just a question about the three generals in question this evening, Napoleon, Haig and Wellington. They all appear to have the same traits in that they seem inured to the cost in both men and materials in the pursuit of a successful outcome. Would you agree that this must be a trait in all good generals?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'll park that second thing and I'll come back and take issue with your question. I don't think Wellington is in the same category, if only for the fact that his army was, for the most part, very small. Certainly in comparison to Napoleon's it was. So what he had, I think about 50,000 troops at Vittoria in 1813, at a time when Napoleon's, well, his army shrunk by that stage, but still got 30,000 or whatever it is to play with. Wellington maybe had a few more. Wellington was always aware if he lost his army, he wasn't going to get another one,
right,
which made him very cautious in many ways. At one level, it means he makes his troops lie down when under bombardment. At another level, it means he's cautious about launching grand attacks. So Wellington, I think, is rather different than Napoleon, who boasted of, the fact what a life of
marching in a straight line. And
absolutely. And Haig, who I don't think thought in the same way as Napoleon, but nonetheless fought what the Germans would describe as a Materialschlacht, which involved him just using his men as though they were a bottomless pit to be replaced, which of course they weren't. That, in my view, is the blackest mark against Haig as a general.
Yeah.
Your second point, I think I would agree with, though I'd phrase it a slightly different way. Generals must be prepared to be ruthless in pursuit of an objective if that objective is worth committing resources to. In other words, if you're going to go all out, there's no point going off half cock.
No, I appreciate that. It's just
and I think that the best comparison actually here is Montgomery. Montgomery, of course, served as a junior officer and then a staff officer on the Western Front. And so he's been through it. I mean, he was wounded as a junior officer at Meteren in October 1914. If you look at the way he conducted Normandy, in many ways, he was a very cautious general. But on occasions, if he thought it was worth throwing all in, he would. I mean, famously, he said he was prepared to lose all of the independent armoured brigades on D-Day if it meant that he got inland and towards Caen or the rest of it. So actually, it's not that Monty, or for that matter, Wellington lacked ruthlessness, is that they were more cautious in husbanding their resources. They would not routinely throw men after an objective in a way that Napoleon and Haig would. Some of this comes then, I think, to compassion, although I think Haig was not a man who lacked compassion, but mainly it comes down to the fact that he knew if he lost his army, Monty in Normandy in 1944 was well aware that there was virtually no troops left in the depots in the UK if he took heavy losses. Wellington in the peninsula knew exactly the same thing, so they were more cautious with the way they used their armies.
I see. With Haig, there was a big concern with the government about the amount of men and materials he was losing, and they tried to wind his neck in for quite a while, didn't they?
That's absolutely right. And the irony is that the most direct warning that was sent to him was by Henry Wilson, I think in September 1918, just at the point you needed to go all out. This was the point you didn't want to hold back.
Yes, he's got to win the thing, hasn't he?
But yeah, but I think that's absolutely right. And I think, the criticism of Haig that he was too easy, too loose with his men's lives, I think is a criticism which is you cannot fault. I must say it's one which John Terraine never really came to terms with.
No. but because he won the war, it would a different matter. If it had gone home and lost it, it would have been castigated dreadfully.
Well, absolutely right. And of course, the other point to make is that you like Wellington, like Napoleon, and in fact, Montgomery, you need to put Haig in the context of the period. He wasn't the only man behaving like this.
No.
And what is really important is that as a result of the sort of the bloodletting of the First World War, there is a national mood in Britain in the Second World War, and Monty was well aware of this, that the nation simply wouldn't tolerate that level of casualties again.
No,
And I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Mark Armstrong. Do you want to unmute yourself there?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Gary. I'd like to remind Gary was my sponsor of my academic paper, my commandant's paper, when I was at the Army Staff College, to which his conclusion was it was a very poor Staff College commander's paper, but it would be very good for an MA, which I might get round to doing one day, Gary. My question is in terms of the attitude, when you compare Wellington and Haig, of their attitude towards Tommy Atkins, particularly after their Waterloo and the First World War, in so much as Wellington opposed the awarding of a campaign medal for Peninsular Wars, describing Tommy Atkins as the scum of the earth, whereas Haig actually spent all his time effectively, didn't he? He then committed the rest of his life to doing what he could for ex-servicemen. And I just think in doing the comparison, you need to look at that different attitude that they had towards Tommy Atkins.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, yes, you're right. Haig did devote his post-war career, the rest of his life, in effect, to the role of ex-serviceman. Now, partly this was because Lloyd George, who was sort of a very bitter and vindictive man, refused to give Haig the big jobs he could otherwise have anticipated. So, Byng ends up as Governor General of Canada. Haig doesn't get anything offered like that. Although I think by the time he retires from the army properly in 1921, Field Marshal never actually technically retired, but effectively when he stepped down from frontline service, he had made the decision to go all out as the champion of the ordinary soldier. I think it does reflect Haig's background as a fairly typical late Victorian Edwardian regimental officer with a great belief in noblesse oblige, the idea that privilege entailed responsibility, and the idea that he had a paternal role towards the ordinary soldiers. Now, it must be said, I should have mentioned this earlier when someone was asking me about politics. There was considerable worry, both on the left and on the right, that Haig had political ambitions. And it's not being wildly going too far into wilds of fantasy to see Haig as a sort of proto-fascist leader, using the British Legion to mobilize ex-servicemen in an anti-democratic form. That's what happened in Germany. It's what happened to some extent in France. It's what happened in Italy. The fact it didn't happen in Britain, I think, owes an awful lot to Haig's conception of what his role was, which was to be a non-political, he really meant small c conservative, but anyway, a non-radical leader of an ex-serviceman's organisation. Wellington, he also was a man of his time. He was a patrician. His infamous army and scum of the earth comments. Scum of the earth, people often forget to add what he said afterwards, which was, they're scum of the earth, but it's amazing what fine fellows the army makes of them. He was a very typical man of his time, as in an upper class man of his time, with a deep fear and resentment of the mob. This is, after all, the time of the French Revolution, and it's by no means clear there isn't going to be a revolution in Britain. And so he is not alone in those views. Though having said that, he could be personally kind to individual soldiers that he would find, on the street or what have you. But he certainly, I don't think, had the same conception of duty as Haig did. And that's because the concept of what an officer was had evolved quite considerably from Wellington's period to Haig's period, with the evolution of ideas of the Christian gentleman and paternalism and all the rest of it. So, put it bluntly, Wellington was a late 18th century Anglo-Irish gentleman. Haig was a late 19th century Anglo-Scottish gentleman, and in that time, the ethos of these classes had changed quite dramatically.
Thank you.
Very much. Thanks for your question there, Mark. Anthony, you've been waiting patiently there for quite a while. Apologies for keeping you waiting, but I just wanted
to...
I wanted to
Gary, very interesting talk. Thanks very much indeed. My question, I've heard it argued that Haig only became attritional when the expected success of his offences failed. Is that a valid argument?
There's something in that, but generally speaking, Haig started with a plan A, which was to break through the enemy positions and carry out manoeuvre warfare, backed up with a plan B. And, he was very adept at saying, this is what I intended to do all along. In fact, thinking about it, John Terraine fell for this somewhat. John Terraine, that is, scripted the episode of the 1960 Great War television series on the Somme. And I watched this a few years ago, and I was quite amazed by his interpretation, because he actually quotes Haig as saying the purposes of this operation are, one, to grind down the enemy, B, to do this, which actually that is true. That Haig did say that, but he only said that basically to sort of give himself a get out of jail free card, because it's very clear from other things that he had written and told people he was hoping to break through. And one of the great criticisms of Haig is that he was too optimistic and too ambitious. He actually would have been better off recognizing from an earlier stage that actually you need to engage in attrition before you can reach the stage of maneuver. I think in the end, he actually reached that position. He realized that that was the sensible way forward, but that's not how he put it in many of his public announcements. It's certainly not how he put it in some of the things he said. And John Terraine really went along with the sort of, this is what he planned all along approach, rather than the truth, which actually is he generally had a plan A and a plan B. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. In fact, he would be a dereliction of duty if he hadn't had a plan A and a plan B. Problem is, I think Haig didn't really understand just how difficult it was going to be to grind the way through the German forces till comparatively late in the day, which I think is a black mark against him as a commander.
So he actually he continued his offences far longer than he should have actually.
Well, up to a point, Lord Copper. The problem is that you can certainly make that argument, and there's an element of truth in that. But also, if you look at the circumstances in which they are being carried out, there are very good reasons, quite apart from the idea you must keep bashing away to carry on. So at the end of the Somme, for example, he's being pressurized by the French to take more action. In the aftermath of during Third Ypres, he believes the French are under enormous pressure and you need to carry on hammering at the Germans. Now, that's actually not necessarily the case. And people at the time, and historians have since have argued that he was wrong. That's not to say he did not genuinely believe it. And the circumstances as he read it were suggesting that that was the way forward. So yes, he did tend to push his offensives on too long. But generally, there are mitigating circumstances for that. So it's not simply a matter of him being too ambitious and not knowing when to stop. So that's a very typical historians on the one hand, on the other answer. I apologise for that, but
no, thank you very much.
That's where we are.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Anthony. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for tonight. many thanks indeed once again to Professor Gary Sheffield. If we can just do a virtual round of applause once more, just to thank Gary for his efforts once again on our behalf to bring us some entertainment on during yet another week of lockdown. That would be tremendous, and I can confirm, Gary, that this hand's going up.
Well, thank you very much, David. As ever, it was a pleasure to do it, and I look forward to talking about John Terraine in a slightly different context later in the year when I've got my PowerPoint
with memory stick to hand.
Memory stick in hand. That's right.
That's tremendous. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for tonight. Upcoming events this coming Thursday. We will have General Sir Herbert Lawrence, the unsung architect of victory, on Thursday night at 8 p.m. And then a week tonight, Monday, the 18th of January, we've got Professor John Bourne, John Terraine, and me, and the 46th Division of Personal Odyssey. So please do, if you've not already done so, register for those. And all being well, I'll see everybody on Thursday and indeed Monday. But from me and from Gary, thanks very much and good night. Thank you.
Mademoiselle.